In this video, you're going to add more content to your grid and see how the browser is going to deal with it. So at the moment, our grid has got 4 rows. And that's because in our template, we set the height of 4 rows. Now, what happens if we create a new row? What dimensions is that row going to have? Well, first of all, let's understand the difference between what we call an explicit grid and an implicit grid. The explicit grid is the content that you created so far inside your grid. So since your grid is supposed to have 4 rows, all items inside these 4 rows are actually inside the explicit grid. Now, once we get out of that explicit grid, we dive into what we call the implicit grid. So that implicit grid is going to have new rules when it comes to dimensions and so on. So let's add one new line by adding a new item and see what happens. So let's add a div, and here we go. We've got a new row there. And now this is part of the implicit grid, which is outside our template. But it's still actually inside the container, isn't it? Well, if you look at the height of this row, it's actually different from the height of the other rows. And it's because we set the height of those 4 rows to one free available space. Now, what the browser has done here is that it's created some space for this new row, which is actually the minimum height needed to fit the content of that div. And then the remaining space has been distributed equally between the other rows. So you can see that Apple's height is 1/4 of the remaining space after we give out any needed height for Facebook. So the extra rows that we created will take by default a minimum height to contain the content of the row. Now, if I create more elements and go for a second row, then the second row will behave the same, and it's going to have a minimum height as well, just like the first extra row. But now the height of the 4 initial rows has decreased, but it's still 1/4 of the remaining space after giving out any needed height for Facebook and Samsung, or these 2 rows. Now let's change our template design and say that instead of having one free space for the 4 initial rows, let's say that we would like to go for 30 pixels or 40 pixels. Now, any extra rows are not going to affect the dimensions of the 4 initial rows. But the extra rows are going to have the necessary height they need to contain their content. And let's increase that slightly just to see the difference. All right. Also, let's remove the height of the container so that it can wrap everything inside it. And by the way, this is supposed to be 4 rows. And let's go for 45 pixels. So you can see the height of the first 4 rows, and you can see the small height of the new 2 rows. Now, it is possible to set the height of these new rows. So let's do this. So I'm going to set the height of any extra rows outside the template. And this is what we call the implicit grid. I'm going to use the grid auto rows property, and let's go for a height of 70 pixels, for example. And you can see that the two new rows has got now a height of 70 pixels. All right. Now, by default, your grid is going to grow rows if you add extra content. But what if in certain circumstances you want it to grow columns instead? Well, there is a property called grid auto flow. And using this property, you can actually decide whether you want to grow columns or rows. By default, it's going to be row, but if I go to column, then any extra content is going to be placed inside new columns like this. And in this scenario, each column is going to have a minimum width which is necessary to fit the content inside the column. I can decide what width I want to have by using another property, which is grid auto columns. And if I set that, for example, to 200 pixels, then the extra columns are going to have a width of 200 pixels. All right. So let's go back to the default way, which is extra rows. So you've got two extra rows here with a height of 70 pixels. So hopefully this gave you a good understanding of the difference between the implicit and the explicit grid, and how to control any extra columns or rows, and also how to control how your grid grows if it goes to the implicit grid. In the next video, you're going to build a new grid example where you're going to control the amount of space different elements are going to take inside your grid. So in this simple example, each element takes one rectangle inside the grid. But in the next example, you can tell the browser that you want, for example, Facebook to take 6 rectangles, and you can specify which rectangles you mean. So let's do that in the next video.